Okay, we are at C4 of the France-Germany talk. And the fourth landmark I'd like to talk about is the Élysée Treaty signed between France and Germany on the 22nd of January 1963. The Élysée Treaty grows out of a rather different project launched by General de Gaulle in 1961. De Gaulle had returned to power in 1958, having left it in 1946. And it's an attempt, really, by de Gaulle to create what he called a European Europe, that is, a Europe independent of American domination and really under French leadership. He tried to create a political community, but his project was effectively rejected by his European partners in April 1962. And de Gaulle then transferred the plan to the Federal Republic of Germany from May 1962. And so you get this exchange of state visits, to which I've already referred, I think, between de Gaulle and Adenauer in July and September 1962. And then you get a treaty of friendship signed in January 1963, which very pointedly made no mention of NATO or of the European Economic Community. And that's the way the French in particular wanted it. The idea was effectively that de Gaulle would find himself as the leading partner in a Franco-German partnership, and then the other four countries of the six would slowly rally behind this core. And Europe would be largely independent of the United States, although still enjoying American protection to a degree. Well, it didn't quite work out like that, because the Americans saw the treaty as a rather hostile act, and President Kennedy began to lobby very hard in Bonn, the West German capital, to get the Bundestag, the West German lower house of parliament, to insert a preamble as it ratified the treaty. And the preamble stated, and it was included in the vote in June 1963, the preamble stated that, of course, the treaty would also further the European integration project, in which Britain would very soon be involved, and it would also further Atlantic defences via NATO. Precisely the opposite, really, of what de Gaulle had been intending in that January. And although de Gaulle tried to put a good face on it, he was recorded saying in July 1963, well, treaties, he said, are like roses and young girls, they last as long as they last. Adenauer a few days later replied that he had roses growing in his house at Rhöndorf, and they had been blossoming happily there for years. So he put a good face on it too. But in fact, the treaty remained inoperative in many ways through the 1960s, through most of de Gaulle's presidency. And Franco-German relations deteriorated quite sharply, especially after Adenauer left office in autumn 1963. They're marked, for example, by the empty chair crisis of 1965 and by sharp disagreements over de Gaulle's veto of British entry in 1967. The Élysée Treaty, however, it should not be written off. On the contrary, in the longer term, it was an important framework for Franco-German cooperation, as we'll see. Landmark number 5 is the summit at Den Haag in 1969, in December 1969, after General de Gaulle has lost his last referendum and resigned as President of France. France has a new president, Georges Pompidou, West Germany a new Chancellor, Willy Brandt, and although the two men personally don't get on together, they agree on the need for a new European initiative, which takes the form, three buzzwords, completion, enlargement, deepening, where completion means completion of the financial system of the Common Agricultural Policy, which is on its feet effectively by 1972. Enlargement means ending de Gaulle's veto on British entry, and the United Kingdom and Denmark and Ireland join the European Economic Community in 1973. Deepening turns out to mean effectively a rather timid programme of European political and diplomatic cooperation. But that's the summit at Den Haag, a relaunch of Europe on a fairly cautious basis in 1969. Landmark number 6 is the creation of the European Council in 1974, and this is the first Giscard-Schmidt initiative. It's not called the European Council in 1974. It starts out simply as an informal meeting of heads of state, if it's the French president, heads of government for other countries, to discuss matters of common interest. It only becomes formally integrated into the Treaty of Amsterdam, in 1997. But it does have importance as something more than just an informal chat between heads of state and government. It constitutes effectively an intergovernmental cap on the integration process. It ensures that although the power of the Commission may rise and fall and in some ways be reinforced over the coming years, there's still always this key group of people, the heads of state and government, who are ultimately responsible for the future development of the European project. It's going to be overwhelmingly intergovernmental rather than supranational, with the Commission imposing its projects on the member states. Then we get to, I think it's C7, isn't it? The creation of the European monetary system, another Giscard-Schmidt project in 1979. This is a bid to contain the monetary instability that's broken out in Europe with the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system in 1971. The Germans didn't like the instability because the Deutschmark was the strongest currency in Europe, and although this was very nice in some ways, it produced constant upward pressure on the Deutschmark, and this meant that German exports became less competitive. So the Germans are looking for a bit more stability. For the French, it's almost the opposite problem. There's downward pressure on the franc, which the French want to limit and secure, hopefully also lower inflation as well. And so it's a project, an agreement to intervene, particularly for the German central bank, the Bundesbank, to intervene on behalf of policy of weaker currencies to a limited extent and secure a degree of monetary stability. But it also requires certain policies, certain anti-inflationary policies on the part of governments within the participants. In the same year, 1979, we also see the first direct elections to the European Parliament. That's C7. Back in a moment.